Good afternoon. As you all know, Britain's public transport is organised in a really weird way. Trains, trams and buses all operate with entirely different systems. Trains are mostly run by private companies but under government contracts. Trams are generally state-owned, and buses in most places are a complete free-for-all, with private operators able to do whatever they want. This is really bad. In the case of buses, private operators can cut routes just a few weeks in advance for no good reason. Furthermore, treating different modes as entirely separate forms of transport understandably leads to poor integration, and buses and trains often end up competing against each other, rather than working together as one cohesive network as they should. There's both a lack of top-down coordination and bottom-up accountability to the public. We don't have the time to cover every problem with the current system, but the result is one that decidedly does not work. Plenty of ideas of what could replace it have been discussed, but in my opinion, far too many of them get bogged down in the nationalisation versus privatisation debate. But this misses the point. Regardless of ownership, how should our transport organisations actually be structured? The answer? Regional transport authorities. Okay, but what actually are they? Well, a regional transport authority, or RTA for short, is an independent or semi-independent body that controls public transport in a region, of all modes. Transport for London is a classic example of an RTA. They control buses, trains, trams and roads, all within a set area, in this case Greater London. We used to have many more RTAs. Until the mid-1980s, most urban buses and trains were operated by the city's Passenger Transport Executive, or PTE. They had lots of freedom, and had their own distinctive colour schemes, integrated ticketing, and would often receive funding to build infrastructure to improve transport in their areas. Many of these PTEs were very successful, like Nexus around Newcastle, with its Tyne metro and integrated bus services. Yet in 1979, Margaret Thatcher was elected to lead a new Conservative government, and she pursued a radical policy of privatisation and a reduction in public spending. The cuts took a while to reach transport, but reach it they did, and in 1986, the intricate PTE system was torn up, with buses being privatised and local authorities stripped of their power to organise their transport networks. This effectively spelt the end for integrated routes and super-cheap fare policies, like South Yorkshire's, which were hardly ever more than a few pence. You don't have to be a genius to figure out what the results were. Bus usage plummeted, and, with a few important exceptions, this trend has continued to the present day. Following the austerity cuts of the 2010s, local authorities became increasingly unable to support vital routes, particularly in rural areas. In fact, some researchers found that as much as 50% of bus services outside of London have been lost over the past decade. Bus deregulation was almost objectively a bad decision, and the people who made it likely knew that. I mean, why else would they have excluded London from the reforms? We mustn't get caught up in doomerism though. The pre-1980 system wasn't perfect. Whilst there were many good PTEs, the service outside of urban areas was generally operated by the National Bus Company, an organisation too large to attract any loyalty, but too fragmented to be particularly effective. On the railways, meanwhile, things definitely improved. Increased investment, mainly public but also private, transformed services and triggered a virtuous circle of passenger growth. Tram networks began to spring up in many British cities, and it looked as if the country was finally realising that you have to account for more than just cars. Down in London, where control of transport was not privatised, buses and trains only went from strength to strength. Passenger numbers grew so much that by 2010, more people were travelling on buses in London than everywhere else in England combined. I should clarify there is nothing inherent about this. London is not the only place in the country suited to public transport use. It was just the one city that was allowed to implement sensible policies. Okay, so Britain today. We've got one city that's doing extremely well with a publicly controlled transport network, and pretty much the rest of the country is failing with a privatised one. Surely we could just put two and two together here, right? Well, no. After deregulation, local councils were still allowed to run their own buses, even though their powers were significantly reduced. Accordingly, several cities and towns kept their municipal bus operators, and most of the ones that survive are very good. Reading Bus, Nottingham City Transport and Lothian and Edinburgh regularly top rankings and win awards for their high-quality services. But there's a bit of survivorship bias here. There are plenty of towns who didn't really think their municipals were that good and later sold them off. Indeed, some were caught up in rather ugly bankruptcies, like Holton Transport just a few years ago. However, even amongst the remaining municipal operators, they're not all great. Cardiff and Newport Bus are fine, but they exhibit some very anachronistic tendencies, like refusing to give change, using hardly any double-deckers, running pretty poor frequencies, and having really limited running hours for a capital city. Conversely, many private operators are doing extremely well, like Brighton and Hove in Brighton and Hove, which runs a very high-quality operation and has overseen passenger numbers balloon to second highest in the country. Or Oxford's assortment of operators, who have come together with the local council to create a service that is really good and even world-leading. Oh, okay then, so should we keep the current private system? Goodness no. Whilst there are exceptions, most private operators are pretty rubbish. Of the large bus companies, Stagecoach and Arriva are particularly poor, and despite some successes before the pandemic, they've since deteriorated to a point where hardly anyone is going to be attracted onto these buses. Still, matters are even worse where there are multiple different bus companies operating within a city. It's very hard to integrate and coordinate when all the parties involved have no interest in working together. Some places, like Oxford and Leicester, have experimented with what's known as an enhanced partnership scheme, where operators voluntarily work with the council. This can deliver some great results, but it is still purely voluntary, and the service is never going to be uniform enough anyway. Clearly, it makes sense for all the services in an area to be under one operator, so you don't have to do any of this complicated partnership stuff. But besides that, if ownership doesn't really matter that much, then what else does? Well, there are several common threads that tie the successful bus operators we've looked at together. Firstly, and arguably most importantly, they all have pretty good leadership. There are actually people in charge of the bus network. It's a very low bar to clear, but they're there, and they do a good job. The management in places like Nottingham, Reading, or all across the north with Transdev Blazefield is very dynamic and innovative, and they've got attracting people onto buses down to a fine art, almost literally. Secondly, willpower can't just come from the operator themselves, it also has to be reciprocated by the local authority. These successful cities have councils that have either initiated improvements themselves or cooperated when improvements were requested. This has granted these places high-quality infrastructure through things like bus lanes, new bus stations, and good passenger information systems. Unfortunately, however, a huge number of councils have seen their public transport departments gutted in recent years. There are now local authorities that have effectively no qualified public transport officials at all, and this must be reversed. Finally, funding. Making public transport better needs money, and we can't be afraid of spending it. Even when taken in isolation, investment in public transport often pays itself back in the form of increased fare revenue as a result of passenger growth. For example, Manchester's new London-style franchising system, the B Network, has seen fare revenue millions of pounds over predictions. Now, funding can come from the private sector, but for truly game-changing improvements like new tram lines, larger bus networks, and integrated ticketing systems, you really need some form of state involvement. In some cases, this means the government giving grants to independent operators, but for wholesale transformations of the network, you might as well just do it yourself. Okay, so those are some of the preconditions for setting up a good bus service. If you want to know more about what makes a good commercial bus service, then I highly recommend the presentation by Roger French, former Managing Director of Brighton and Hove Buses, entitled Secrets of a Successful Bus Operation. However, plenty of places can't have commercial buses, and, as we've seen before, public control is an extremely useful tool when it comes to delivering improvements. Indeed, in many cases, it's almost essential. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. There is a temptation to put the control of all our transport networks in the hands of democratically elected authorities, like councils or even central government. But I've been involved in a couple of transport projects run that way, and goodness please, no. Outside of major cities at least, most people in positions of political influence do not use public transport on a regular basis. If they think about it at all, they tend to view it as a sort of safety net for the most desperate, and not an essential aspect of creating a more sustainable world. Even when they do have the right ideas, they're often not knowledgeable or skilled enough to implement them properly. I'd love to give examples, but I'm afraid I don't have the heart. Now, obviously, to an extent, this is just democracy, but it's also not. Infrastructure goes way beyond electoral cycles. There needs to be a competent authority with competent people in it that decides how money should be spent. And, over 10 minutes into the video, dear me, that will be a regional transport authority. You may ask though, why regional? And indeed, how large should these regions be? Well, regional power is what's really missing in Britain. In countries like Germany or even the US, they have states. Spain has autonomies, and even the usually centralised France has regions. As for Britain though, much of England just doesn't have anything between local councils and central government. It's a great shame, as notwithstanding other reasons, this is probably the best level on which to organise transport policy. National organisations are often too large and disconnected from local communities to be particularly effective. British Rail came dangerously close to this. Many lines, particularly rural ones, were seen as inconvenient and were thus run down or even closed. At the other end of the spectrum though, you don't want too small operators either. Not only do you not get the efficiency benefits of keeping everything relatively centralised, but you can simply have a competency shortage. After all, why would a tiny organisation hire a team of graphic designers, planners, data analysts, managers, engineers, and so on? Once again, a middle ground has to be struck, and looking at successful transport systems around the globe, it seems like a regional system is the best way to go. In some parts of the UK though, this missing middle tier, so to speak, already exists. Ignoring Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland for a moment, they're called combined authorities, and many were created in just the past few years. As the name suggests, they're formed of multiple councils working together strategically. And whilst I think that some of them are a bit odd, it's these that should have the Regional Transport Authority role assigned to them. This has already happened in some of the more established combined authorities, Greater Manchester and Greater London being the obvious examples. And well, they're doing great things. As for size, I think it's far less important than the established line of thinking seems to suggest. Quite a lot of places are extremely dissatisfied with the idea of moving under a combined authority. In some cases, I think this is perfectly justifiable, like with Cornwall. Forcing it into cooperation with elsewhere would probably do more harm than good, and Cornwall's current devolution settlement is working pretty well. Transport for Cornwall is hardly ever discussed, but it's leading one of the best rural operations in the UK. However, there are other circumstances when I feel like councils are just being stubborn for no good reason, and need to acknowledge that most places in Britain turn to a major city. There are multipolar regions, and that's fine, but there are also places that are obviously just one city, yet they seem to be in complete denial for some reason. Besides, if Bolton and Wigan can suck it up and be part of Greater Manchester, then surely the likes of Stoke Gifford can tolerate being part of Bristol. Anyway, we're getting off topic. These regions should be in control of their own regional transport authorities. If they want, they can allow individual cities and towns the ability to manage their own networks. That's fine, it's their choice. But there will still be a broader regional authority that manages transport, including trains. Railways are extremely difficult to organise. Whilst an urban metro system is pretty self-contained and thus straightforward, a mixed-traffic national network needs national coordination. But it's entirely possible to keep that while still having local control. In his recent book, rail engineer and fellow YouTuber Gareth Dennis suggests a national railway organisation that manages standards and consistency, as well as training up and maintaining technical knowledge. But the decisions about what actually gets done are made at the local and regional levels, by, in this case, the Regional Transport Authority. I'm a fan of this idea, and it would see the newly created Great British Railways be something perhaps a little more like the Office of Rail and Road than the original British Rail. The beauty of giving the regional authority power over network planning and short-distance operations is that it can create a cohesive and coherent network, one that is able to really shift people out of cars. But there's still one missing piece to the puzzle. Even if you were to create these regional transport authorities, give them the right powers, staff them with amazing people, and let them have enough time to bed in, it would still all be for nothing if you didn't give them any money. It's not just day-to-day funding too. At a time when virtually no one denies the importance of public transport in cities, we've more or less completely stopped building new tram lines or underground systems. But we can start again. We've done it before, even quite recently, and with this good structure, our towns and cities could quite easily be transformed for the better. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I'm very sorry that this took so long to make. Hopefully my next videos will be a little lighter. See you next time.